All right, welcome to Chapter 2. We're going to be talking about critical thinking. We'll also introduce sociological theory. Because this class deals with the study of marriage and family from a sociological perspective, it's important that we understand a little about how this research impacts the study. So what we'll do is basically unpack how social scientists in the field of sociology go about developing and understanding this information. One of the most important things that you'll do as a student in the field of marriage and family therapy is understand how to think critically. So to think critically means we seek to understand, analyze, and evaluate information. So we have to realize that there is a sort of enemy. We can be entrapped by categories. We can basically be trapped by how our family thinks, sort of automatic thinking. And also, we can not entertain other viewpoints. So there are a few steps in critical thinking. The first, we need to get an understanding of the issue in question and avoid rushes in judgment. So we want to not rush to judgment. So in order to take the issue on its own terms, let's gather information. Specifically, peer-reviewed journal articles are always the best. Some of you know how to find peer-reviewed journal articles. Something like Google Scholar or EBSCOhost. Feel free to throw in research that you find into your discussion board posts. This will only help you. Secondly, the next step, develop a solution and carry it out. So if you want to sort of, based on the research, develop an approach to the problem, and then you evaluate the plan's effectiveness. This is actually right out of applied sociology, which uses principles of sociology to tackle social problems. Some people may have a more curious disposition. People like myself went into the social sciences because I had questions about how people developed their identity. I had questions such as how divorce impacts a child and through their development. I was innately curious. Other people, however, may not have this disposition, but you can still be a good social scientist. So skills can be learned. For instance, research tools such as knowing good sources, skills such as communication, asking good open-ended questions, and critical thinking. All these can be learned. So as long as you're willing enough to learn, then you can be an expert in this area of marriage and family research. Sociology greatly emphasizes social theory. A theory is basically some ideas about how the world works. So the statements follow rules that define the relationships of these statements to each other. They help us understand the context of relationships and help us make decisions. So in the field of marriage and family theory, these theories basically help us develop research models, and that can actually help us to a great degree. This class is really designed to be a second class after you've taken general psychology. So if you have taken general psychology, you will remember the difference between macro and micro. Macro level theories, basically like the 3,000 foot view. Imagine you're looking at society from 3,000 feet in the air. Conversely, if you are studying micro level, imagine going into a marriage or family situation, and you're looking at it literally from a bottom-up instead of a top-down approach. So we're going to look into specific sociological theories. This is a brief refresher course if you have already taken Introduction to Sociology, but if not, don't worry, because I think you can understand them. So if you want to follow along on page 59 of your textbook, this is going to help us out. Okay, so the first sociological theory that we'll look at is structural functional perspective. The word structural speaks to what the theory studies. It studies social structures. Right? The family is a social institution. Sociologists may refer to structural variables as large things like the military or education or religion. So from a structural functional perspective, the family exists for basically certain functions. All right, the functions include to replenish society with socialized members, to promote emotional stability, to provide economic support, to care for the sick and the elderly, and to regulate sexual behavior. So it's really important to understand structural functional theory and its emphasis on institutions, values, norms, and activities intended to provide stability for society at large. So historically, the functionalists have argued that society depends on manifest functions. So the manifest function of the family is the intended, openly stated, conscious purpose of the family, right? However, with any manifest function, there are also latent or unintended consequences. So, for instance, if families have a manifest function of providing love and care, perhaps a dad spends time playing with his child, right? The latent function is that those kids are actually healthier. Research indicates that the more active a dad is playing with his children, the less frequently we see obesity. So in that case, that would be a latent function. Now, functionalists have also historically been pretty conservative. The functionalists of the early 1930s, 40s, and 50s argued that males are typically instrumental, being that logical, breadwinner, confident leader. Women taking the expressive role, females, homemakers, nurturing, etc. Now, more modern functionalists would argue that some leaders are instrumental and some are expressive regardless of gender. So react to this on the discussion board. Do you know any women who are instrumental, logical, thought-driven? Do you know any males who are expressive, such as relying on group morale in terms of their leadership? Conflict theory was largely influenced by the thoughts of Karl Marx. Karl Marx's theory was originally economic in nature, but as sociology began to develop, many thinkers have used his ideas and developed sociological models based on that. So, for instance, the way sociology has taken Marx's ideas is that conflict is a normal and natural part of relationships. The signals that there needs to be change. It depends on how the conflict is managed that will determine if it is bad. Now, the feminist movement has taken Karl Marx's ideas. We'll talk about that in greater detail, but the idea of power and who owns or who has more power in a relationship is also something that we will address. Symbolic interaction is a micro-level theory, which means it is as if we are walking into the context of the family. But the word symbols is that's also important. So for instance, symbols speak to how I perceive marriage. Two individuals may have two different symbols of what marriage means. So with regard to family, this theory focuses on the processes of internal family interactions, the ongoing action-response cycle. Behavior is understood only by the meaning or value of each individual assigns to symbols and actions, based on learned schemas and self-image. So symbolic interaction also tells us that I have a symbol for myself. I have a symbol for good, bad. And so you have one partner in marriage and the other partner in marriage. Both have different symbols, and this affects interaction. Well, the emphasis on family systems perspective is equilibrium. This theory sees individual family members as a system of interconnected parts or subsystems. So you actually have a marital system, the system between two spouses. You have a system between each of those spouses and the children, and also systems that entail relationships with outside family members. These systems can be open or closed, flexible or inflexible, and when one part changes its status, the role changes, and other members must adjust to maintain equilibrium. Social exchange perspective states that individuals seek the most benefit with the least cost. So it's as if every member in a family or potential mate during courtship is looking for basically a cost-benefit analysis. How does this relationship benefit me? If what I give up, is it more than what I'm going to get? Bad. Or will I get more in return for my investment? Right? So the concept of a walk-away wife would basically be when a woman who feels as though she is spending more energy than she is returning. Give this some thought and respond in the discussion board accordingly. Do you think this is accurate or not? So as previously mentioned, the feminist perspective produced a lot of sociological thinkers influenced by Karl Marx. Gloria Steinem is one of the leaders of the feminist movement who quotes Marx almost every time that I've heard her speak. And essentially, feminist movement is a subset of conflict theory. The idea here is of power and control in marriage, that there is a power hierarchy and men has historically been at the top. Women have been subordinate to men. There have been great strides in public policy. The feminist perspective would argue that the improved divorce rate has been a sign of improvement, that women are exercising their freedoms, that they're voting with their feet, if you will. And so to understand the relationship between feminist theory and conflict theory will help us to understand the context of marriage and family research. And so many have argued that in the vacuum left of feminist theory that men's studies have developed, that men needed a movement of their own. As with many theories and many different movements, there's actually many different strains. An anti-feminist movement, a sort of a masculinist movement, the idea that men can actually embrace their masculinity with also encouraging sensitivity to be more balanced in terms of their gender expression. The ecological perspective has been promoted by social scientists by the name of Bronfenbrenner. Bronfenbrenner is a unique name, but it's connected with the ecological perspective, which basically says a family is influenced by and in turn influences its environment. So for instance, a family influences a school system, and a school system influences the family, right? A neighborhood influences families, and the families influence the neighborhood. So the question for you is, how do factors outside the home influence attitudes within the home? Do you think you would have been a different person if you grew up in a different neighborhood? Respond to that in the message board if you have something to say. So the family development perspective argues that families each have members that accomplish certain developmental tasks as they move through the stages of the life cycle. So for instance, a developmental task fills a specific role. These expectations and responsibilities match a new status. And this perspective really puts a lot of emphasis on children moving through this cycle, playing the role of a child, parents also fulfilling their respective roles. So progressing from the last slide, just take a look at what the family life cycle stage looks like. So you have the stage at the beginning of the family. Couples are newly married without children, been married within 0 to 10 years. During the childbearing years, couples have young children, the oldest child's up to 3 years. And then you have preschool families where the couples with children not yet enrolled in school. The oldest child's probably under 5 years of age. As families progress to school age, the oldest child's 6 to 12 years, 12 years, 11 months. Couples with children attended primary school or junior high. Number 5, you have teenage families, couples with children attending high school. The oldest child's about 18 years of age. Stage 6, you have the launching center families. These families have their first child leaving for college. Stage 7, you have middle-aged parents in an empty nest. So the last child's leaving and parents move towards retirement. In stage 8, retired couples without children in the home kind of progress towards death of the first spouse. Now, as we look at all these theories, we always ask our students in this class if there is any theory that is better than the other. And that's not really the right question. The right question is, when are each of these theories best used or best served? And that might help us out if we ask the right question. So for instance, the structural functionalist theory offers ideas about stability and order. They would more narrowly define family. They would see divorce as negative, destroying society, and not as an indicator of needed change. So the conflict school really challenges us to look at who benefits from power and control. Even those words, power and control, might even cause sociologists from other schools just to have pause, the idea of someone having power in a relationship. However, to the conflict school, it's everything. They see conflict as a signal that change is necessary, and they stress conflict over order. So the Symbolic Interactionist school would focus on attention to the daily interactions of family members. It would ignore larger social influences such as economics, public policy. It doesn't focus on personality, temperament, or power structures, but it would stress individual happiness over familial duty and stability. And also, I would add that this emphasis would include perspective. How do people perceive any particular issue? You hear the adage, perception is reality. This is very much relevant to the symbolic interactionist way of thinking. Family systems theory focuses on the interconnectedness and emphasizes importance of members to the whole. So there are certain dynamic aspects that can restore equilibrium. However, this is not well defined to be applied to functional families and doesn't recognize the wider social forces such as ecological theory by Bronfenbrenner. Social exchange theory looks at the cost-benefit analysis that family members, according to their theory, constantly undergo. But the problem, some say, is that it assumes that people always act in rational and calculating ways. Some say there is an emphasis on the individual being self-serving over altruism and family values. So the idea that someone would actually give even if there's nothing in return. Just to this point, I will give you a quick story from my personal life. I remember going to a wedding shower for me and my wife. This was given by my community. I had one individual, an older lady, came up to me and she said, "Some say that marriage is 50-50, but it's not. Sometimes marriage will be 100-0. Sometimes you can't give anything and the spouse has to. And other times you will feel as though you're giving 100% of all the effort." And in my 17 plus years of marriage, I would say this was probably the most applicable. There are times when there really doesn't seem to be anything in it for us except for valuing the whole and valuing and love for the person. So that's just something to think about, not to diminish those that would see something from social exchange theory. It is a theory for the purposes of developing research. The feminist perspective embraces many viewpoints that bring attention to the fact that our roles are constructs of society to maintain power. This is used for stressing personal feelings over objective, quantitative research. So each of these theories may have specific uses. The feminist theory and perspective kind of highlights historical as well, so the historical American change. And so this will be something that we refer to as we go on. Bronfenbrenner's ecological theory stresses the interactions of families with a larger political societal environment, but does not explain how each might exert and change the other. And the family developmental theory emphasizes the importance of completion of developmental tasks. It stresses the importance of status role agreement, but does not recognize that stages are not so clearly marked. So if you take, for instance, the influence of society on these developmental stages. Sometimes people move through these different developmental stages at different trajectories or different times, and it looks different. Some would argue that this is not comprehensive enough of a theory. So research into the family and into marriage from a social science perspective requires the scientific theory if it's going to be true science. So if there is no scientific method in social science, then we don't have a science. So in order to have the scientific method, we must have a hypothesis. My students oftentimes refer to this as an educated guess, and it is, but it is usually an if-then statement. It's a proposed explanation of behavior that is not proven, but can be tested. So the scientific method is a systematic approach to observing phenomena in the family, drawing conclusions, and testing hypotheses. And the sociological theories oftentimes develop the hypotheses that we're testing. Research methods can be quantitative or qualitative. With qualitative or ethnographic research, we're using symbolic interaction type models where we're going into an environment and listening to stories. That's a separate research class. But quantitative research methods use the scientific method to test specifically defined hypotheses. They use numbers to describe and explain those issues being studied. And the creme de la creme to psychologists and social scientists is the research experiment. Now, sociologists oftentimes move away from an experiment. What I say in my intro class is that sociologists oftentimes prefer the living room to the lab room, right? Because we don't like the artificial created social context. But regardless, that an experiment is great if it's done right. When you have a good experiment, you must have an independent variable, you must have a dependent variable, so you need a factor that is manipulated by the researcher and a factor that we're looking at to measure change. We must control for extraneous variables, and we do this through a random sample. It's critical in the social sciences. Sociologists love surveys. It is really the bread and butter and the backbone. It usually involves questions. They can be closed-ended, but they could be open-ended. It just would require sophisticated scoring if it's an open-ended model. But we do also do a lot of observations. So what this means is we will specifically define the research purpose, plan it systematically, record it systematically, and then we must record this data and check for reliability and validity. So observations need to be very well spelled out, specifically if it's a participant observation where we're actually interacting in the environment. So as a critical thinker, you must begin to evaluate the research studies that you're looking into. So it's important, if you're looking at research on the family, that you look at the methods section, because then you can evaluate, were there flaws in the research study? Is the researcher biased? Is the sample biased? Meaning, am I only looking at one group of people? Was there a control group? Are the questions not naturally worded? Are there time and other distortions? Is this a recent study? And are there questions to the reliability or the validity of the research study? Now, if you take any other classes in the social sciences, these questions will be timeless, it will help you, they will serve you well. So always look at the research methods of these articles or books that you're reading about this class. So with this, we're done with Chapter 2, and I hope you find this informative and enlightening. Take care.